Greg moved silently through the dark, expansive halls of the high-rise building. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the empty lobby, marking the passing of each minute. He was on another late-night shift, a routine that had become all too familiar. His uniform, though neat and proper, seemed out of place in the luxurious building he guarded. It was as if he didn't belong in this world, even though he had once been a part of it. As a security guard, Greg was invisible. No one looked at him twice. He wasn't meant to be seen. He was simply a part of the background. But as he patrolled the building's pristine corridors, Greg couldn't help but reflect on the life he had left behind. Years ago, he had been someone with ambition, an entrepreneur with a vision. He had dreams of success, of climbing the ranks of society. But all of that had been shattered by the woman he had loved. Krystal, his ex-wife, had once been the center of his world. She was beautiful, ambitious, and constantly seeking more. More wealth, more status, more luxury. At first, Greg had thought they were a perfect match. But the more he tried to keep up with her desires, the more he fell short. The late nights, the endless work, and the pressure to provide her with the lavish lifestyle she demanded only pushed them further apart. Eventually, it became too much. Krystal had left him, finding comfort in the arms of a wealthy businessman, a man who could offer her everything Greg could not. The divorce had been final, and with it, Greg had retreated from the life he once knew. He had chosen simplicity, choosing to work as a security guard, hiding from the expectations of his former life. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his choice. A life without the weight of materialism, a life far from the woman who had once been his everything. The end of Greg and Krystal's marriage had never made sense to him. He had tried to make her happy, but nothing was ever enough. Krystal had always wanted more, constantly striving for a life filled with luxury and status. She wanted a man who could give her everything she dreamed of, a life of ease, designer clothes, lavish vacations, a mansion. And when Greg's entrepreneurial ventures faltered, when he couldn't provide the material things she longed for, she decided he wasn't enough. One night, as they sat in their modern apartment, Krystal had looked at him with cold, emotionless eyes and delivered the devastating blow. "Greg," she had said, "I need more than just love. I need security, stability. I need someone who can give me the life I deserve." Those words echoed in his mind, and they still haunted him. He had tried to fight for their marriage, tried to prove that love was enough, but it hadn't been. Krystal had already made up her mind. She filed for divorce, and Greg was left to pick up the shattered pieces of a life that had once seemed so full of promise. In the years that followed, Greg chose a life of solitude. He rejected the wealth and expectations his family had offered him, choosing instead to live modestly. He worked as a security guard in a nondescript building, far from the high-end world he had once inhabited. It was a life of quiet humility, a life where no one expected anything from him. But deep down, he still struggled with the memories of what he had lost, of what Krystal had taken from him. Greg's ordinary life was disrupted one evening when he was assigned to work at a prestigious event held in a luxury hotel. He had been working the night shift for weeks, so when the invitation had come through the office, he had been chosen for this particular night. His job was simple: monitor the security cameras and make sure everything went smoothly. He didn't think much of it. After all, it was just another event. But as he entered the grand ballroom, everything changed. Greg's eyes locked on her almost immediately. There, standing among the guests in a crowd of glittering gowns and tuxedos, was Krystal. She was more radiant than he remembered, dressed in a sophisticated gown that shimmered under the soft lights of the ballroom. Her beauty had only grown over the years, and for a moment, Greg was lost in her presence. Krystal was laughing with her new husband, a well-dressed man who oozed the wealth and confidence Greg had never been able to offer her. She was everything Greg had once dreamed of being: successful, powerful, and surrounded by the elite. And yet, as she spoke, Greg realized that she hadn't even noticed him yet. He had become nothing more than a shadow to her. Krystal was still the same woman he had known, but in many ways, she was different. She seemed so out of reach now, untouchable, almost. He couldn't help but feel a pang of resentment, mixed with a deep sadness. How had they ended up like this? How had she been able to move on so easily, while he remained trapped in the past? Greg watched from the sidelines, his emotions tangled. He wasn't sure if it was anger, regret, or something else entirely, but one thing was clear. He wasn't the man Krystal had married anymore. He was no longer the ambitious entrepreneur trying to meet her impossible standards, and maybe that was for the best. After the gala event, Greg tried to push Krystal from his mind. He had seen her again, but she was no longer the woman he had known. She was part of a different world now, one that had no place for him. His shift resumed as normal, and life continued with its usual monotony. But despite his best efforts, he couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. Every night, as he walked the hallways of the building, memories of his past life came rushing back. The lavish dinners, the promises of a future together, and the way Krystal had smiled at him when things were good, before the cracks began to show. He could still recall the nights they had stayed up talking about their dreams, his hopes for their future, and how she had once told him that she would always be by his side. But now, it seemed as if that future had never existed. Krystal had left him without hesitation, abandoning the man she had once claimed to love for someone wealthier, someone who could give her everything she desired. Greg's bitterness lingered, not only from the divorce, but from the realization that he had been nothing more than a stepping stone for her to climb higher. As days passed, Greg began to notice small details that reminded him of her, old memories that would resurface in the quiet moments of his shifts. He couldn't help but replay every interaction, every hurtful word, every look of disappointment she had given him over the years. It was as if a part of him had never truly healed. The next few weeks blurred by as Greg continued his work, but things began to change when a new assignment came his way. One of the building's owners, a successful businessman, was hosting a private event, and Greg was selected to be the lead security guard. It was a position he didn't take lightly, and despite his uneventful job, he performed it with meticulous care. But things took an unexpected turn when Greg's true identity came to light. His role as a security guard was just a small part of who he really was. Unknown to everyone around him, Greg was the heir to a vast fortune, a fortune he had walked away from years ago. His family had been wealthy, influential, and well-respected in the business world. But Greg had always resented the pressure that came with his family name. His decision to live a modest life had been deliberate. After his divorce from Krystal, Greg had felt the need to escape the world of wealth and power that had defined his past. He wanted nothing more than to live simply, without the expectations that came with his name. So, he had left the life of luxury behind, choosing to work as a security guard, far from the business world that his family dominated. But fate had a different plan. When the businessman hosting the private event learned about Greg's connection to the family fortune, he was taken aback. It wasn't long before whispers started circulating around the building, and people began to recognize Greg for who he truly was. His colleagues, who had once looked down on him, began to treat him with a newfound respect, some even with awe. The whispers turned to curiosity, and soon everyone was talking about the man they had once dismissed. At first, Greg didn't know how to react to the sudden shift in attention. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable. He had never sought the limelight, and the idea of being thrust into it again unsettled him. But it became clear that his past had come rushing back to haunt him, whether he wanted it or not. As Greg's identity became known, Krystal, who had been attending the same private event, was blindsided by the revelation. She had no idea that the man she had once discarded had been hiding such a powerful secret. When she learned that Greg was the heir to one of the wealthiest families in the city, her world shifted. She had always seen Greg as a simple man, a man who didn't measure up to her ambitions. His humble job as a security guard had only reinforced the image she had created of him. She had thought he would remain small, unnoticed, and out of her life for good. But now, hearing of his true identity, Krystal was shaken. The man she had dismissed was someone far beyond the reach she had ever imagined. At first, Krystal refused to believe it. She thought there must have been some mistake, some misunderstanding, She had grown accustomed to the life she had built with her new husband, a wealthy businessman who could offer her all the material comforts she had ever dreamed of. But now, hearing of Greg's true status, she couldn't help but feel a mix of jealousy and regret. She had left him for this very reason: his inability to meet her expectations, to provide her with the luxury she craved. And now, the tables had turned. Greg was not the man she had once known. He was more powerful, more influential, and yet, despite everything, he seemed perfectly content with the simple life he had chosen. Krystal's emotions were torn. Part of her wanted to reach out to Greg, to ask for his forgiveness, to admit that she had made a mistake. But another part of her was afraid that she had lost the chance to be with him forever. Would he ever forgive her for the way she had treated him? Would he even want to have anything to do with her now that he knew the truth? Unable to stay away, Krystal arranged to meet with Greg. She had to confront him, to see if there was any chance of salvaging what they had lost. But when they met, the distance between them was palpable. Greg had changed, not just in his circumstances, but in his very demeanor. He no longer needed to prove himself to her, to anyone. He was free, and she was no longer the center of his world. Their conversation was awkward, filled with unspoken words. Krystal tried to explain herself, to apologize for the way she had treated him, but Greg's response was calm, distant. "I've moved on, Krystal," he said simply. "I'm not the same person I was when we were together." The words stung, but Krystal knew he was right. She had pushed him away for far too long, and now he was out of her reach. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Krystal realized that she had been the one to let go, not him. As she left the meeting, Krystal couldn't help but wonder if she had missed her chance. She had chosen a life of wealth and status over love, and now she was alone, trapped in the very world she had once so desperately sought. Greg sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of the recent revelations still heavy on his mind. The truth about his identity had shaken everything he had tried to build in his quiet life. The whispers around the office had turned into rumors, and soon, everyone knew that he was the heir to a vast fortune. But as the days passed, Greg found himself questioning why it mattered. The wealth that had once been so important to him no longer held the same allure. He had walked away from it all for a reason, and that reason hadn't changed. But there was one thing that still haunted him: Krystal. Despite everything, he couldn't shake the image of her face when she had found out about his true identity. He had seen the flicker of surprise, of disbelief in her eyes. For so long, he had been nothing in her eyes: a security guard, a failure, a man who couldn't live up to her standards. Yet now, he had become someone who, in her eyes, could offer everything she wanted, everything she had once left him for. Greg's mind spun with the possibilities. Was Krystal truly sorry for what had happened between them? Was she regretting her decision? Or was she simply trying to reclaim what she had lost? The past was a painful thing to revisit, but it was also a part of him that he couldn't escape. He had to confront it if he wanted to move forward. Krystal stood before her mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. She had always prided herself on her ability to make the right choices, to be in control of her life. But after learning the truth about Greg's identity, everything had unraveled. For the first time, she found herself questioning everything she had believed in. Her life with her new husband, Adam, had seemed perfect. Adam was wealthy, charming, and gave her the lifestyle she had always wanted. They attended glamorous events, traveled to exotic destinations, and lived in a mansion. But now, Krystal wondered if that was enough. She had always wanted the finer things in life. But when she looked at herself in the mirror, she realized that she had lost something far more valuable: love. Krystal had always been ambitious, driven by the desire for wealth and status. But what she had failed to see was that love, real love, wasn't something that could be bought. When she had left Greg, she had believed she was choosing a better future for herself, a future filled with luxury and security. But now that Greg was back in her life, the truth was inescapable. She had chosen the wrong things, and now she was faced with the consequences. She missed Greg more than she cared to admit. He had been the one person who had always treated her with kindness and respect, the one person who had truly cared for her. And yet, she had discarded him without a second thought, blinded by her own desires. As she lay in bed beside Adam that night, Krystal couldn't help but wonder if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. Days passed, and Greg's life seemed to continue on its quiet course. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel a nagging emptiness. The memories of Krystal lingered, and despite his resolve to move on, he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for something to happen. He didn't want to go back to the past, but a part of him couldn't resist the pull of what they had once shared. One evening, as Greg finished his shift, he walked outside into the crisp night air. He had just locked up the building when he saw a familiar figure standing near his car. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized her, Krystal. Her face was a mixture of uncertainty and determination, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, with everything they had both been carrying for so long. Krystal was the first to break the silence. "Greg," she said softly, her voice tinged with emotion, "I need to talk to you." Greg didn't know what to say. He had promised himself he would never be that man again, the one who would drop everything for her. But something in her voice made him pause. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, and for a moment, the man he once was resurfaced. "I don't know what you expect from me, Krystal," he replied, his voice steady but guarded. "I'm not the person I was when we were together. I've moved on. I've built my life without you." Krystal took a step forward, her eyes pleading. I know I made mistakes, but I need you to understand. I was wrong, Greg. I was so focused on the wrong things, and now I see that. I was never truly happy, not without you." Greg's heart tightened at her words. Was this truly an apology, or was it just a reaction to the shock of discovering his true identity? He had waited for her to come back, but now that she was standing before him, asking for his forgiveness, he wasn't sure if he was ready to let her back in. "I've changed, Krystal," Greg said quietly. "I've spent years trying to forget the person I was when we were together. I've built a new life, and I don't know if I can just let you in again. I'm not the man you left behind." Krystal reached out, her hand trembling. "Please, Greg, I'm not asking for anything more than a chance. Just a chance to prove that I can be the woman you once loved." For a moment, Greg's resolve faltered. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, but he also knew the pain she had caused him. The trust between them had been shattered, and no amount of words could undo that. Yet, deep inside, he couldn't deny that a small part of him still cared for her. "Let's take this one step at a time," Greg said, his voice low. "I'm not saying I can forgive you yet, but I'll give you the chance to show me that you mean it. But don't expect me to forget." Krystal nodded, relief flooding her face. "I'll do whatever it takes, Greg. I won't let you down." As they stood there in the quiet of the night, both uncertain of the future but willing to take the first step toward healing, Greg realized that this was more than just about love. It was about trust, forgiveness, and whether they could rebuild what had once been broken. The days following their encounter were filled with uncertainty, but Greg couldn't deny that there was a part of him that still felt a connection to Krystal. She had come to him with sincerity, asking for a second chance, but the past was a hard thing to overcome. Greg wasn't sure if he was ready to let her back into his life, but he couldn't help the flicker of hope that had ignited deep inside him. They agreed to meet a few times, their conversations awkward at first, filled with tentative glances and hesitant words. Krystal was patient, taking things slowly, but Greg remained guarded. He had been burned before, and the scars ran deep. Trust was a fragile thing, and he wasn't sure he could trust her again. But as the days passed, something began to shift. They started to open up, talking not just about the past but about the present, their hopes, their regrets, and the mistakes they had made. For Krystal, it was a journey of self-realization. She had spent so many years chasing after the wrong things, luxury, status, the approval of others, that she had never stopped to think about what truly mattered. And what truly mattered, she now realized, was love. Krystal's sincerity was evident in everything she did. She didn't expect Greg to forgive her immediately, and she wasn't trying to win him over with grand gestures. Instead, she showed him, with every action, that she was willing to work for his trust. It wasn't easy, and Greg didn't let his guard down easily, but the more they talked, the more he realized that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. As Greg and Krystal's fragile relationship began to rebuild, they were faced with a challenge neither of them could have anticipated. Krystal's life, the one she had chosen after leaving Greg, was not so easily forgotten. Her new husband, Adam, had noticed the growing distance between them. He had always been a jealous man, controlling in ways Krystal had chosen to overlook. But now that she was reconnecting with Greg, things took a darker turn. One evening, Adam confronted Krystal about her newfound closeness with Greg. His voice was cold, his tone sharp as he demanded answers. "What's going on between you two?" he asked, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You think I don't see the way you've been acting? Don't think for a second that I don't know what's happening." Krystal had always been able to maintain control over her emotions, but Adam's accusations cut deep. She had tried to convince herself that she could handle both her past with Greg and her present with Adam, but now the cracks were showing. The truth was, her heart was no longer fully invested in her marriage to Adam. She realized, with growing clarity, that she had married for the wrong reasons. She had married for security, for wealth, for a life that seemed perfect on the outside but lacked the love and fulfillment she craved. "I'm not the same person I was when we first met, Adam," Krystal said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the internal battle she faced. "I've been talking to Greg, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you." Adam's laugh was bitter. "You think I don't see what's happening? You're still in love with him, aren't you?" Krystal was silent for a moment, the truth weighing heavily on her chest. She had spent so long convincing herself that her life with Adam was what she wanted, but the feelings she had for Greg had never truly gone away. They had been buried under the weight of expectations and societal pressures, but now, with each passing day, they resurfaced. "Yes," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I always have been." Adam's expression darkened. "If you think I'm going to stand by and watch you ruin everything we've built, Krystal, you're wrong." The confrontation left Krystal shaken, but it also solidified something in her heart. She couldn't continue living a lie, pretending that her marriage was something it wasn't. She had to face the reality of her feelings for Greg, even if it meant losing everything she had worked so hard for. Krystal knew that the path ahead was uncertain, but she also knew that she couldn't keep living in fear of the consequences of her choices. It was time to make a decision, and that decision had to be hers alone. She couldn't let Adam dictate her life any longer. She had to follow her heart, even if it meant taking risks. The next day, she called Greg and asked to meet him. As they sat down in a quiet cafe, Krystal could feel the weight of the moment hanging between them. There was so much left unsaid, so many things they needed to work through, but there was one thing she knew for certain. She wanted to be with him. She wanted to rebuild the life they had once dreamed of, even if it meant facing the fallout of her past decisions. "I've made my choice, Greg," Krystal said, her voice steady but her eyes filled with emotion. "I don't want to live in the shadows of my past anymore. I don't want to pretend that I'm happy when I'm not. I'm leaving Adam." Greg's heart skipped a beat as he looked at her, his mind racing. He had never expected Krystal to make such a bold decision, but as he looked into her eyes, he could see the sincerity in her words. She was choosing him, choosing love over wealth, choosing to face the consequences of her actions and make things right. "I know it won't be easy," Krystal continued, "but I'm willing to fight for us, for the love we once shared. I'm not asking for a second chance, Greg. I'm asking for a future." Greg was silent for a long moment, his mind whirling with everything that had happened between them. He had spent so many years nursing his wounds, trying to move on from the pain Krystal had caused. But as he looked at her, he realized that he had never truly stopped loving her. His heart still ached for her, for the woman she had been, and for the woman she was becoming. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were, Krystal," Greg said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "But I'm willing to try. For us. For what we can be together." Krystal's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of all the mistakes she had made begin to lift. This wasn't just about love. It was about redemption, about the possibility of a future where they could heal together. As they held each other in the quiet cafe, surrounded by the bustling world outside, both Greg and Krystal knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, they felt as if they were on the right path. They had made their choice, and it was a choice that could change everything. Krystal's confession had shaken Greg to his core. For so long, he had tried to convince himself that he had moved on, that the woman who had once been his everything was no longer part of his life. But as he sat across from her, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes, the walls he had carefully built around his heart began to crack. Krystal had chosen him, and in that moment, Greg felt a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, hope, and fear. He had waited for years for her to come back, but now that she was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready to let go of the pain that had been festering inside him. The years of loneliness, the betrayal, the feeling of being discarded for someone else's wealth, it wasn't something he could simply forget. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Krystal," Greg said, his voice tight with the emotion he struggled to control. "I don't know if I can forget the way you left, the way you didn't even look back. I've built a life without you, and I've learned to survive without you. You have no idea how much it hurt when you walked away." Krystal's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to him, but he recoiled, the sting of her abandonment still fresh in his mind. "I never meant to hurt you," Krystal whispered, "but I hurt you, and I know that now. I made the wrong choices, Greg, and I can't undo the past. But what I can do is fight for us, fight for the love we once had. I know it will take time, but I'm asking you to let me try." Greg sat in silence, his mind racing. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness, a desperate attempt to undo the mistakes of the past. But his heart couldn't fully trust her again, not yet, and so, he made a decision. "I need time, Krystal. I need time to think," Greg said, his voice firm but tinged with uncertainty. "I'm not saying no, but I'm not ready to say yes either." Krystal nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She understood, but that didn't make the pain any less real. She had made her choice, but the journey ahead would be a long and difficult one. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Greg had promised Krystal time, but the space between them only seemed to grow. Krystal moved out of her home with Adam, but she had nowhere to go. She couldn't return to her parents. They had never understood her relationship with Greg, nor had they approved of her choices. She had spent years chasing a dream of wealth and status, but now those dreams seemed hollow. She had left everything behind, but she had nothing to show for it. Krystal found herself standing outside Greg's apartment one evening, hesitating. She had nowhere else to go, and her heart was heavy with the weight of her decisions. As she stood there, she saw the flicker of light from inside and made up her mind. She knocked on the door, her pulse racing. When Greg opened the door, he was surprised to see her standing there, looking uncertain but resolute. "Krystal," he said, his voice softening slightly, "what are you doing here?" "I don't have anywhere else to go," Krystal admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've burned all my bridges, Greg. I thought I could live without you, but I was wrong. I don't want to live without you anymore. Please, can I stay here? Just for a little while?" Greg's heart wrenched at the sight of her. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the way she had let go of her pride, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to take that next step. He had spent so long building a life of independence, a life where he didn't have to depend on anyone. But seeing Krystal, standing there with nothing left, reminded him of the woman she once was, the woman he had fallen in love with. After a long moment of hesitation, Greg sighed. "You can stay, but only for a while, and we'll take this one day at a time." Krystal nodded, relief washing over her. She didn't expect everything to be fixed overnight, but this was the first step. She was willing to fight for their future, and that started with regaining Greg's trust. As the days passed, Krystal moved into Greg's apartment, though she remained cautious, not wanting to push him too hard. She kept to herself, spending her days thinking about what had brought her to this point. It wasn't just about Greg anymore. It was about rediscovering who she was, what truly mattered. She had spent so many years running from herself, trying to be someone she wasn't, that she had forgotten what it was like to simply be happy. Greg, too, found himself grappling with his feelings. Having Krystal in his space again stirred old memories of their love, their shared dreams, and the painful heartbreak when she had left him. But as he watched her, he noticed something different. She wasn't the same woman who had walked away all those years ago. She had changed, and so had he. They were no longer the people they once were, but the connection between them still lingered, like an unspoken bond they couldn't shake. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Krystal broke the silence. "Greg," she said, her voice tentative but filled with resolve. "I know you don't trust me yet. I know I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want you to know that I'm here, not just because I have nowhere else to go, but because I want to rebuild with you. I want to be the woman you can trust again. I don't want to be the person who walked away from everything we had." Greg listened carefully, his heart still heavy with doubts, but he could see the sincerity in her eyes. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart were beginning to crumble. He could feel himself being drawn back to her, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. "I'm not sure what this is going to look like," Greg replied quietly, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give us a chance. But it's not going to be easy. We'll both have to work at it every single day." Krystal smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Greg. I've learned the hard way what's important, and I want to prove to you that I can be the woman you need. I love you. I never stopped." Greg reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away the tears. "I don't know what the future holds, Krystal, but I'm willing to take that first step with you." And for the first time in a long while, both of them allowed themselves to believe that love, though complicated and fragile, was still worth fighting for. As the weeks passed, Greg and Krystal continued to navigate the delicate balance between rebuilding their relationship and confronting the remnants of their past. Krystal's presence in Greg's life had slowly become a part of his daily routine, yet there were still moments of hesitation. Greg wasn't ready to open his heart completely again, and Krystal understood. She had burned too many bridges to expect everything to be perfect overnight. Still, she was determined to prove herself. One afternoon, Greg was on his way home from work when he received a call from his old friend, Simon. The conversation started casually, but as they spoke, Simon mentioned something that sent a pang of anxiety through Greg's chest. "Hey, Greg, I saw Krystal the other day," Simon said. "I guess things are going well for you too. But, man, I'm not sure if you're making the right choice. I mean, after everything that happened, you've got to wonder if it's really worth going back. People don't just change overnight." Greg felt his stomach tighten. He had heard those same words echoed by so many others. His family, his friends, even his own doubts. Could Krystal truly change? Could he ever forgive her for what she had done? "I know you're concerned, Simon," Greg said, trying to keep his voice steady, "but I have to figure this out on my own. I'm not going to rush into anything." After the call, Greg sat in silence, staring at the phone in his hand. Simon's words lingered in his mind, and he couldn't help but wonder if he was making a mistake. It wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about trust. Could he trust Krystal again? Could he trust himself to not get hurt? When he returned home, he found Krystal sitting at the kitchen table, looking over some documents. Her gaze lifted as he entered, and she smiled warmly. But Greg couldn't shake the weight of his doubts. It had become harder to ignore the barriers still between them. "Hey," Krystal said softly, her voice cautious. "You okay?" Greg hesitated, then took a seat across from her. "I'm not sure, Krystal," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about everything that's been said and done, and I don't know if I can just forget it. People keep telling me that I shouldn't go back to you, and I guess I'm starting to wonder if they're right. Krystal's face fell, her heart sinking as she processed his words. Greg, I don't expect you to just forget, but I'm asking for a chance. A real chance. I'm not asking for forgiveness overnight, but I need you to believe that I'm here for you. I've made mistakes, and I'll keep proving to you that I want to be the person you deserve. Greg's heart ached at the sincerity in her voice. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at him with so much love. But love was complicated. Forgiveness wasn't something he could offer easily. The pain of the past still lingered, and it wasn't something he could shake off just because Krystal had changed. I'm not sure if I can do this, Krystal, Greg said softly, his voice filled with uncertainty. I want to believe you, but I don't know how to let go of the past. Krystal nodded, her throat tight. I understand, but I'll keep fighting for us, Greg. Even if it takes years, I'll fight. Greg didn't know what to say. He wasn't sure if he could ever let go of the hurt, but he knew one thing. He wasn't ready to give up on them completely. Despite the emotional distance that still lingered between them, Greg and Krystal continued to move forward, step by careful step. Krystal's patience became the cornerstone of their journey. She didn't push him. She didn't demand things from him that he wasn't ready to give. She simply remained present, waiting for him to come to terms with his feelings, letting him take the lead in his own time. But the test came sooner than either of them expected. One evening, after Greg returned home from a late meeting, he found Krystal sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes red. It was clear that something was wrong. Krystal, what happened? Greg asked, his voice filled with concern as he rushed to her side. I got a call from Adam, Krystal said, her voice shaking. He wants me back, Greg. He says he's changed. He says he's sorry for everything. But I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can trust him either. Greg froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Adam had been Krystal's ex-husband, the one she had left for Greg all those years ago. Now, Adam was trying to re-enter her life, claiming to have changed. Does he know about us? Greg asked, his voice low, a hint of jealousy creeping in despite his efforts to stay calm. Krystal shook her head. No, he doesn't. I haven't told him about you, but he's persistent. He won't leave me alone. Greg felt a surge of possessiveness, a mixture of fear and frustration rising in him. The last thing he wanted was for Adam to come back into Krystal's life and tear them apart. But this wasn't just about Adam. It was about Krystal's own choice. I don't want to lose you again, Krystal, Greg admitted, his voice breaking slightly, but I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between us. You deserve someone who is certain about you, someone who isn't still holding on to the past. Krystal looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had to make. She had been through so much already, but now, the past was knocking on her door again. I don't want him back, Greg, Krystal said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her words. I'm not going back to him. I made my choice and it's you. I want us to have a future together, but I need you to trust me. I can't keep running from my past, but I'm choosing you. I want you, Greg, not him. Greg exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he believed her. He wasn't sure if they could ever fully erase the scars of the past, but he was willing to try. I believe you, Greg said quietly, taking her hand in his. I'm not going anywhere. The days following Krystal's confrontation with Adam were difficult but necessary. Adam, frustrated and angry, tried to reassert his presence in Krystal's life, but she stood firm in her decision. Greg's support, though quiet and reserved, was a constant presence. Krystal knew that this would be a long road, but she was committed to fighting for their future. As the weeks passed, Greg slowly began to open up more, allowing himself to let go of the resentment he had held onto for so long. He could feel the walls around his heart beginning to crack. Trust wasn't easy, but Krystal had proven, time and time again, that she was willing to do whatever it took to rebuild their relationship. They began to talk more, really talk, about their fears, their dreams, and the kind of future they wanted to build together. They made small changes, starting with simple gestures, holding hands, sharing meals, spending quiet evenings together. These moments became the foundation of their healing, their slow but steady rebuilding. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Greg turned to Krystal, a small but genuine smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Maybe we can actually make this work," he said softly, his voice tinged with hope. Krystal smiled back, her heart light for the first time in a long while. "I think we can." And with that, they both knew that they weren't just healing from the past. They were building something new, something stronger than before. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but together, they were ready to face whatever came their way. The months following Krystal's decision to sever ties with Adam were a turning point for both her and Greg. For the first time, Greg truly felt that they were heading in the right direction. However, despite the peace they had found in each other's arms, life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges their way. One morning, as Greg was getting ready to leave for work, he received a call that sent a jolt of panic through his body. It was from Krystal's workplace. Her boss, an arrogant and demanding executive, had apparently filed a formal complaint against her, accusing her of misconduct at the office. The allegations were shocking. It claimed that Krystal had been involved in several underhanded deals, including bribery and corruption, all in an effort to sabotage the company's image. Greg's mind raced as he immediately called Krystal. His heart thudded in his chest as he waited for her to pick up. "Krystal, are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I don't know," Krystal replied, her voice strained. "Greg, this isn't true. I didn't do anything. I swear. But they're insisting on an investigation, and I'm scared they'll fire me. You know how they've been looking for an excuse to get rid of me." Greg's anger flared. He knew how toxic her workplace had been, especially with the way her boss constantly undermined her. But to accuse her of something so vile, it felt like an attack on everything they had worked so hard to rebuild. "I'll take care of this," Greg said firmly, determination building in his voice. "I'll go to your office and talk to them. We'll fix this, Krystal." "I don't want you to make it worse," Krystal protested weakly. "I don't want you to get caught up in this." But Greg had already made up his mind. His trust in Krystal had solidified, and he knew that she wasn't capable of such dishonesty. If there was anyone who would stand up for her, it was him. As he hung up the phone, he didn't hesitate for a second. He dressed quickly, and within the hour, he was standing at Krystal's office, ready to confront her boss and the Human Resources Department. Greg walked into Krystal's office building, his resolve steely as he approached the reception desk. The receptionist, a woman who had always been polite to Krystal, looked up in surprise. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, eyeing him curiously. "I need to speak with Mr. Jenkins," Greg said, his tone brokering no argument. "I'm here to discuss the false allegations against Krystal Thompson." The receptionist hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Greg's posture made it clear that he wasn't going to back down. "I'll let him know you're here," she said, picking up the phone. Greg waited in the lobby, his mind working through every possible angle of the confrontation he was about to face. He couldn't let Krystal's career be destroyed over something she didn't do. He needed to remain calm and composed, even if it meant standing up to people who had the power to make her life miserable. A few moments later, Mr. Jenkins, the smug and condescending head of the department, appeared in the lobby. His expression faltered when he saw Greg standing there, clearly not expecting the confrontation. "What is this about?" Jenkins asked, his tone dismissive. "I don't have time for personal matters, Thompson." Greg's eyes narrowed. "It's about the false accusations you filed against Krystal. I'm here to make it clear that they're untrue, and I'm not leaving until this gets resolved." Jenkins smirked, as though he was amused by Greg's boldness. "And you think you can just waltz in here and fix things for her? She's made her bed. Now she has to lie in it." Greg felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice steady. "She didn't do anything wrong. This is a smear campaign, and I'm going to make sure you're held accountable for it. If you don't clear her name immediately, I'll make sure the whole company knows exactly what kind of person you are." The tension in the room was palpable. Jenkins, realizing that Greg wasn't backing down, finally relented. "Fine, I'll initiate an internal review. But if this blows up in our faces, it's on you," Jenkins warned, his tone colder now. Greg stood his ground, unwavering. "I'll take that risk, but you'll be sorry if you don't do the right thing." After a tense silence, Greg turned and walked out of the office. He knew the battle wasn't over yet, but this was the first step in protecting Krystal. That evening, when Greg returned home, he found Krystal sitting on the couch, her face a mixture of exhaustion and worry. "How did it go?" Krystal asked, her voice barely a whisper. Greg smiled, despite the weight of the situation. "We're not out of the woods yet, but I think they'll take the review seriously. You'll be cleared." Krystal's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Greg. You didn't have to do this for me." "I'd do anything for you," Greg said softly, sitting beside her and taking her hand in his. "We're in this together, Krystal." The days that followed were tense. Greg and Krystal waited anxiously for the results of the internal review, knowing that the outcome would determine her future at the company. But Greg's actions had started a ripple effect. More employees who had witnessed Krystal's hard work and integrity came forward to testify on her behalf, sharing their accounts of the way she had been unfairly treated. Finally, the day arrived when the investigation was completed. Krystal's boss, Mr. Jenkins, reluctantly called her into his office. Greg was by her side, his presence offering strength and reassurance. "Krystal, after a thorough review, we've concluded that the allegations were unfounded," Jenkins said coldly, his pride stinging as he relented. "There's no evidence to support the claims against you." Krystal's heart leaped in her chest as she heard the words she had been hoping for. She turned to Greg, who was standing just behind her. His proud smile was all the confirmation she needed. "I knew you'd do it," she whispered to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. Greg grinned. "I told you we'd make it through this together." Jenkins, clearly irritated by the turn of events, handed Krystal her file. "Consider yourself lucky, but don't forget who helped you in this situation." Krystal nodded politely, refusing to engage with his condescending attitude. "I won't forget," she said, her voice steady, "and thank you for clearing my name." As Greg and Krystal left the office building hand in hand, Krystal couldn't help but feel a sense of liberation. Not only had she cleared her name, but she also realized just how far she had come in her journey. She had faced adversity, betrayal, and doubt, yet here she was, stronger and more confident than ever before. Greg's support had been unwavering, and in return, she was beginning to trust him fully again. Their relationship was still fragile, but the foundation they were building was stronger than anything she had experienced before. As they walked out into the bright sunlight, Greg turned to Krystal, his eyes filled with affection. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" he said softly. Krystal smiled, her heart full. "Yes, but we're stronger for it. And this is just the beginning." With that, they walked into a new chapter of their lives, a chapter filled with hope, trust, and the promise of a future built together. In the weeks following Krystal's triumphant clearance, she felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The tension at work slowly dissipated, and with Greg by her side, she was more confident than ever. The moment she had feared most, the moment she could lose everything, had come and gone, and she had come out stronger. But life had a way of testing her resilience, and just as she began to feel at ease, another storm approached. Greg had been unusually quiet recently, and Krystal couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. It wasn't the first time she had noticed his distant demeanor, but this time, it felt different. He had been working late, burying himself in his job, and when they were together, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. It was as though there was something he was keeping from her. One evening, after they had finished dinner, Krystal decided to address the growing silence between them. "Greg," she began softly, her eyes studying him, "I know something's been bothering you. You haven't been yourself lately. What's going on?" Greg set his fork down, his gaze flickering toward her before he sighed. "It's nothing," he said quickly. "It's just work. You know how it is." Krystal frowned, sensing that he wasn't being completely honest with her. "Greg, we've been through too much for you to hide things from me. You can tell me anything." Greg stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't want to burden you with it. I'm fine." But Krystal wasn't about to let him off so easily. "I know you're not fine. We've been through too much to let anything come between us now." He looked at her, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might tell her the truth. Instead, he remained silent, his emotions a storm he was unwilling to share. Krystal stood up, crossing the room to stand in front of him. "Greg, please," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to go through this alone." Greg's walls cracked, and he exhaled deeply. "I've been offered a promotion," he said finally, his words hanging in the air. "It's a huge opportunity, one I've been working towards for a long time. But the catch is, I'd have to relocate." The room felt like it froze for a moment. Krystal's mind raced as she processed the revelation. The thought of Greg leaving, of their lives being torn apart once again, sent a wave of panic through her. "Relocate," she repeated, her voice shaking. "But we've just started to build something here. What about us?" Greg's face was torn with indecision. "I don't want to leave you, Krystal, but this could be my big break. It's a chance for me to make something of myself. I don't know what to do." Krystal's heart pounded as she realized the weight of the decision that was hanging in the balance. "I understand why this is important to you," she said slowly. "But what about us, Greg? We've already lost so much time. Can we really afford to be apart again?" Greg's eyes softened, filled with a mix of guilt and love. "I don't know if I can leave you, but I also don't know if I can pass up this opportunity." The room was heavy with the weight of their dilemma, and as Krystal stood there, holding his gaze, she realized that the choice before them wasn't just about work. It was about their future. Would they continue to sacrifice for their careers, or would they finally choose each other? The days that followed the revelation of Greg's promotion were filled with tension and uncertainty. Neither of them knew what to do. Krystal couldn't help but feel torn. On the one hand, she understood how much this promotion meant to Greg. It was the opportunity he had worked for, the recognition of his dedication and ambition. But on the other hand, she knew how fragile their relationship was, and the idea of being separated again felt like a blow to everything they had fought to rebuild. Krystal spent the next few days weighing her options. She knew that Greg had been working tirelessly to build a future for them, but she couldn't ignore the nagging fear that they were still standing on shaky ground. They hadn't yet fully healed from the scars of the past, and the thought of putting distance between them seemed like too much to bear. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Krystal sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. The quiet of the night surrounded her, but her thoughts were anything but peaceful. She didn't want to lose Greg again. They had already come so far, and the thought of returning to a life without him was unbearable. But as she sat there, a realization began to form in her mind. This wasn't just about the promotion. This was about them, about their ability to compromise, to sacrifice for each other. It wasn't about what Greg could gain by leaving, but what they could build together if they stayed. Her decision was made. The next day, Krystal waited until Greg returned from work. She could see the tension in his posture as he walked in, the weight of the decision still hanging over him. "Greg," she said softly, her voice calm but filled with conviction, "I've been thinking." Greg turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "Krystal, I've made up my mind," she interrupted, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I think I've been selfish. I've been so focused on my own fear of losing you that I haven't been thinking about how we can make this work together." Greg's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I'm willing to go with you," Krystal said, her voice steady now. "I'll go wherever you need me to. If this promotion means so much to you, I'll support it. I won't stand in your way anymore." Greg stood frozen for a moment, as though processing her words. "But Krystal, are you sure? I don't want to take you away from everything you've built here." Krystal reached out and took his hand. "Greg, I'm not afraid anymore. We've been through so much. and I know we can make it through anything. If you think this promotion will help us build a future, then I'll go with you. Together." Tears welled up in Greg's eyes as he pulled Krystal into his arms. "I don't deserve you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've sacrificed so much for me. I promise this time, I won't let you down." Krystal smiled, feeling the weight of the decision lift from her shoulders. For the first time in months, she felt at peace. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. The decision had been made, and life seemed to move forward with a renewed sense of purpose. Greg's promotion was finalized, and they began making plans to relocate. The prospect of starting fresh in a new city was both exciting and daunting, but Krystal had no doubts now. They had learned to navigate the darkest times of their relationship, and this was their chance to create a future that was built on love, trust, and mutual support. As the days passed, Krystal packed up her things, saying goodbye to her friends and colleagues with a bittersweet sense of closure. She had spent so much time at the company, fighting for her place, but she knew that this was the next step in her journey, one that would bring her closer to Greg and to the life they were beginning to build together. Greg, too, was excited but nervous. The promotion was a huge opportunity for him, but he knew that their success would depend on how well they adapted to the change. It wasn't just about career advancement. It was about making sure their relationship stayed strong through the transition. As they loaded their belongings into the moving truck, Krystal turned to Greg, her heart swelling with love. "Ready for our next adventure?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Greg smiled, taking her hand in his. "As long as we're together, I'm ready for anything." With that, they set off toward a new chapter in their lives. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Together, they could conquer anything. The weeks following Greg and Krystal's decision to relocate were a whirlwind of change. Packing up their lives, saying final goodbyes, and preparing for a fresh start took its toll, but neither of them minded. In fact, they were both excited. Krystal had a sense of adventure she hadn't felt in years. She was leaving behind her familiar surroundings and career, but she was doing it with Greg, the man she had come to trust more than anyone. The move was bittersweet. She had worked so hard to build her career and reputation at her old job, and saying goodbye to her colleagues was emotionally taxing. But the thought of starting fresh with Greg in a new city gave her hope. It was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, a chapter they would write together. Greg, on the other hand, was thrilled about the promotion. The opportunity to lead in a bigger capacity excited him, but the biggest shift was his relationship with Krystal. Every decision he made now had a new dimension. Krystal was no longer just his girlfriend, but his partner in everything. She was his anchor, and he was ready to prove to her that he could live up to the love and trust she had shown him. The move itself was a challenge, as they had to adjust to a completely new environment. They found a cozy apartment in the city, a far cry from their previous homes. The space was small, but it was theirs. There were unpacked boxes scattered around, and everything felt a bit chaotic, but Greg and Krystal took it all in stride. One night, after a particularly exhausting day of unpacking, they sat together on the couch, enjoying the quiet of their new space. "We did it," Krystal said, her eyes gleaming. "It feels surreal." Greg smiled, leaning his head back against the cushions. "I know, it's been a long journey, but we're here, together." As Krystal snuggled closer to him, a sense of contentment filled the air. Their future felt like a blank canvas, waiting for them to paint their story. And for the first time in a long time, Krystal felt sure of what she wanted. She wanted this. She wanted him. Settling into their new life wasn't without its challenges, but with each passing day, they grew more comfortable. Krystal started looking for new job opportunities, understanding that she had to make her own mark in this new city. The prospect of starting over professionally was daunting, but Krystal was determined. She wasn't just going to stand by Greg's side. She was going to find her own place in this new world they had built together. Greg, too, had his work cut out for him. The promotion came with a mountain of responsibility. His team was larger, the stakes higher, and the expectations immense. But as he walked into the new office each morning, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing it for Krystal, for them. One day, after a particularly exhausting week, Greg suggested they take a weekend trip out of the city. Krystal was initially hesitant. She didn't want to leave unfinished work behind, but she knew it would be good for them to take a break. They drove out to a small lake house, surrounded by nature, where they could disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. As they sat on the dock, watching the sun set over the water, Krystal turned to Greg, her eyes full of appreciation. "I don't know how you do it all," she said softly. "You've got this huge new job, and you're still here with me, helping me through everything." Greg took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm not doing it alone, Krystal. I've got you. We've got each other." That night, as they lay in bed, Krystal found herself overwhelmed by how far they had come. Their love had weathered storms she never thought they'd survive, and now they were in a place where they could truly start fresh. There were still challenges ahead, but she felt confident they could face them together. Several months passed, and the initial excitement of their new life began to settle into a comfortable routine. Greg thrived in his new role, earning respect and admiration from his colleagues. Krystal had found a new job at a company she admired, one that allowed her to use her skills and feel fulfilled. But more than anything, she was happy just to be with Greg. It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Krystal came home from work to find a small bouquet of flowers waiting for her on the kitchen counter. A card was tucked inside, and when she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. It read simply, "For the love of my life." Greg stepped into the room behind her, a nervous smile on his face. "I know things have been crazy lately, and I know I haven't always been the best at expressing myself, but I just want you to know how much you mean to me." Krystal felt tears welling in her eyes as she turned to face him. "Greg, you don't have to do this. I know how much you love me. We've been through so much, and I wouldn't want to be with anyone else." Greg took a step closer, taking her hands in his. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything we've been through. We've overcome so much, and I realize now that I don't want to spend another moment without you." Krystal's heart raced as she looked into his eyes, feeling the depth of his words. "What are you saying?" Greg took a deep breath, then dropped to one knee, pulling out a small, velvet box. "Krystal, will you marry me?" Tears flowed freely down Krystal's face as she gasped in surprise. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The moment was perfect in its simplicity. In that instant, everything they had fought for, every sacrifice, every hardship, every tear, it all led to this moment. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.